Nobody saw it coming. One moment, Caitlin Clark was the engine powering the most watched era in the WNBA history. The next, she was walking off the court with a quad strain, and the entire financial architecture of women's basketball started shaking at its foundation. This wasn't just a sports injury. This was a 2-week countdown that could determine whether WNBA players walk into the most important contract negotiations in league history holding a royal flush or a hand with nothing in it. And the most alarming part? The damage had already started before she even missed her first game. Here's what most people don't fully grasp about Caitlin Clark's place in the WNBA. It isn't just that she's the best player or the most marketable face, it's that she functions as the league's entire economic spine. Remove her from the equation, even temporarily, and the numbers don't just dip, they collapse. To understand the scale of this, you need to look at what happens in cities when they find out she's coming to town. Teams don't just sell out their usual arenas, they relocate to bigger venues. They spend money on new promotional campaigns, they hire additional staff, they negotiate with larger facilities knowing that the demand will be there. Cities that haven't sold out a sporting event in years are suddenly turning people away at the door. Hotels in those cities fill up. Restaurants near the arena see unusual weekend traffic. The economic impact of one player visiting a single city for a single night is something that most sports franchises spend years trying to manufacture and never quite achieve. That's not hyperbole. That's just the reality of what Caitlin Clark had become for the WNBA by the time this injury hit. So when her quad strain was announced and the Indiana Fever confirmed she'd be sidelined for around 2 weeks, the first domino fell almost immediately, and it fell loudly. The Washington Mystics had made a decision weeks in advance. Their upcoming game against the Indiana Fever was going to be special, and they treated it accordingly. They moved the contest out of their standard venue and booked a larger arena. They had already run promotional campaigns, staff had been contracted, logistics had been arranged. The whole operation was built on one foundational assumption, that Caitlin Clark would be on that court and that her presence would fill every single seat. Then came the injury announcement. What happened next was the kind of thing that makes league executives stare at spreadsheets in silence. Ticket prices, which had been elevated in anticipation of a sellout, were slashed overnight. Not trimmed, slashed. Prices dropped by more than half in some sections within hours of the news breaking, and even at those reduced prices, sales stalled. Entire sections of the arena sat empty on game night. Fans who had purchased tickets in advance started making other plans. The Indiana Fever, without their superstar, drew the kind of crowd you'd expect for a midweek preseason game in a city that doesn't particularly follow basketball. The Mystics weren't alone in feeling this. Across the league, visiting cities that had prepared for a Clark-driven attendance spike suddenly found themselves recalculating. Hotels that had seen unusual booking patterns started processing cancellations. The ripple effect was instant and visible, and it revealed something that WNBA leadership had been desperately hoping wouldn't get tested quite so publicly, quite so soon. The league's attendance boom wasn't evenly distributed, it was concentrated in one jersey number. If you follow soccer even casually, this situation probably sounds familiar. When Lionel Messi signed with Inter Miami and MLS suddenly found itself with the most famous athlete on the planet in its ranks, something very similar happened. Cities went wild when Miami came to town. Stadiums that normally operated at half capacity were turning fans away. Ticket prices surged. Television numbers that MLS had never seen before started appearing. The league was experiencing a genuine phenomenon. And then Messi got hurt.
Fans who had paid premium prices to see Messi specifically felt cheated. They demanded refunds, compensation, something to acknowledge that what they'd paid for wasn't what they received. The backlash was loud and immediate. But here's what MLS did that was actually quite smart. They didn't try to argue that Messi wasn't the reason people showed up. They didn't insist that the league's growth was broader and more organic and that fans would have come anyway. They acknowledged the reality. MLS teams started offering free tickets to future games, free concessions, direct acknowledgments that Messi was the draw and that his absence represented a legitimate grievance for paying customers. That transparency was strategically intelligent. It managed fan expectations. It protected the relationship between the league and its new audience. It treated the situation honestly rather than trying to reframe a disappointment as something else entirely. The WNBA took a completely different approach. For the better part of 2 years, as Caitlin Clark's arrival sent attendance and viewership numbers to places the league had never seen before her arrival, the WNBA leadership pushed a very specific narrative. The growth was organic. The interest was league-wide. Women's basketball was finally getting the recognition it had always deserved, and every player on every roster was contributing to this historic moment. The league had turned a financial corner, and the future was bright for everyone involved. It was a compelling story. It was also, as these 2 weeks were about to demonstrate, almost entirely disconnected from reality. The WNBA didn't just fail to acknowledge its Messi, it actively denied having one. And that denial was about to become extraordinarily expensive. Let's set aside the narratives and just look at the data, because the data tells a story that no amount of careful messaging can soften. When Caitlin Clark plays, WNBA games regularly poll between 1.5 and 2 million television viewers. These are numbers the league had genuinely never seen before her arrival. Records that had stood for years were being shattered on a near-weekly basis. Advertisers who had never paid serious attention to women's professional basketball were suddenly calling. Broadcast partners were thrilled. The financial projections for the league were being revised upward in ways that would have seemed impossible just 3 years ago. When Caitlin Clark doesn't play, those same games draw somewhere around 400,000 on a strong night. And based on projections analysts were floating around the time of the injury, some games during her absence were at risk of falling below 200,000 viewers total. Read those numbers again slowly, because they matter enormously. The difference between a Clark game and a non-Clark game isn't a slight dip. It isn't the kind of modest fluctuation you'd expect when any star player misses time. It's a drop of somewhere between 60 and 80%, depending on the matchup. That isn't a league that's thriving broadly. That's a league where one player is personally responsible for the majority of the commercial value being generated. The attendance figures paint an equally stark picture. Indiana Fever games with Clark in the lineup regularly sell out venues holding 17,000 seats. Other WNBA games featuring legitimate stars and skilled players struggle to fill arenas that hold 8,000. When Clark visits a city on an away trip, ticket prices spike, and sections that normally sit empty are suddenly occupied. Remove her from the road schedule, and those same arenas go back to the attendance figures they were posting before she entered the league. This is not a healthy competitive ecosystem where multiple stars drive value across multiple markets. This is a single point of failure situation, and the injury just made that undeniable. Here's where the story stops being just about attendance and viewership and starts being about something with genuine long-term consequences for every woman playing professional basketball in America. The WNBA's collective bargaining negotiations were already on the horizon when Clark got hurt, and players had spent months building what they believed was a powerful, data-backed case for dramatically improved compensation and conditions. The asks were significant: substantially higher salaries, charter flights instead of commercial travel, better housing allowances, childcare support, expanded rosters. These weren't unreasonable demands in isolation. Many of them were long overdue. Players had legitimate grievances built up over years of being asked to treat a professional career as something closer to a passion project than a sustainable livelihood. And they thought they finally had the leverage to force real change.
They could point to sold-out arenas. They could point to television ratings that had shattered records. They could point to merchandise sales that had climbed dramatically. They could point to expansion teams and new investment flowing into the league. Every data point they needed to justify their demands seemed to be moving in the right direction, and the timing felt like something players had been waiting for their entire careers. Then, Clark's quad gave out. Because here's what 2 weeks of deflated attendance and cratered viewership does to that negotiating position. It hands team owners the single most powerful counterargument imaginable. They don't need to dispute the record ratings from the past 2 years. They just need to point to what happened the moment Clark wasn't available. They can say with complete factual accuracy that when your entire commercial model depends on a single player who can be removed from the equation by a training room accident, you don't have a thriving league, you have a very expensive vulnerability. And from that position, the conversation about charter flights and six-figure salary increases becomes significantly harder to have. This next part is uncomfortable, but it's the reality of how professional sports operates as a business, and understanding it matters for anyone trying to make sense of what comes next. Smart money insiders were quietly observing that team owners had a financial incentive for the attendance and ratings during Clark's absence to be as bad as possible. Not because they want the league to fail, they don't. They have significant capital invested in these franchises. But because bad numbers during this 2-week window give them an extraordinarily powerful tool when they sit down across the table from the Players Association. Think about it from a purely business perspective. If you're a franchise owner and you're being asked to commit to dramatically higher operating costs, higher salaries, better travel arrangements, improved facilities, expanded support staff, you need to be able to project that those costs are sustainable. You need to believe that the revenue streams supporting those commitments will remain stable or grow over time. But if your league just demonstrated that removing one player from the lineup cuts your revenue by 70 or 80%, you have a very serious problem making that case. And when your negotiating counterpart is asking you to treat the entire roster like superstars, you can point to the 2 weeks of empty arenas and ask with complete sincerity how exactly that's supposed to work. The cruel irony is that the players who were most excited about the league's recent growth, the ones who had finally started to believe that Rio financial security was within reach, are the same ones whose leverage just evaporated. And it happened not because of anything they did wrong, but because the league's commercial structure was never as broad as it appeared. It's worth taking a clear-eyed look at who else in the WNBA actually moves the needle commercially, because this question sits at the center of the entire negotiating debate. Paige Bueckers is genuinely exciting, and she came into the league with enormous anticipation. Her audience is real and growing, but conservative estimates put her draw at roughly half of Clark's, and that gap matters significantly when you're trying to make the case that the league has multiple franchise-level attractions. Angel Reese has built a massive social media presence and generated genuine cultural buzz, but analysts who track the actual attendance and viewership data are pretty consistent in their assessment. Fans are more interested in Reese's personality, her rivalry narrative, and her presence online than in watching her play basketball specifically. That's not a criticism of her as a player, it's just an honest description of what she actually drives commercially, which is a different thing. Players like Sabrina Ionescu, Breanna Stewart, and Aja Wilson are genuinely elite. They're among the best basketball players on the planet, but their presence on a schedule doesn't meaningfully spike ticket sales or television numbers in the way that Clark's does. The Seattle Storm, the Las Vegas Aces, the New York Liberty, these are franchises with legitimate talent and real fan bases, but they don't fill arenas in visiting cities the way Indiana Fever road games do with Clark in the lineup. This isn't a slight against any of these players. It's an acknowledgement that star power in professional sports is extremely rare and extraordinarily difficult to manufacture.
The WNBA has one player who functions as a genuine national draw. It has several excellent players. Those two categories are not the same thing, and conflating them has been central to the confusion around the league's recent growth story.
Team owners know this, and in a negotiating room, that knowledge is leverage. If you want to find the most genuinely strange dimension of this entire situation, consider Caitlin Clark's own financial position relative to the chaos her injury has created. Caitlin Clark came into the league on a standard rookie contract. That contract, by WNBA standards, was actually competitive, but by any broader comparison to athletes generating equivalent commercial value, it represents a fraction of what she'd be worth in a different environment. Male athletes with comparable impact on their respective leagues are operating on contracts that dwarf anything the WNBA's current structure allows. The mismatch is significant, and it's been a consistent point of conversation among people who follow sports business closely. Here's the part that makes the whole thing feel almost deliberately unfair. Other players whose games don't individually drive ticket sales or television ratings, have seen their commercial environments improve substantially because of the attention Clark brought to the league. Sponsorship money that came in because of Clark's audience reached players who weren't personally responsible for generating it. Attendance revenue from games where Clark was the draw flowed into a league-wide pool that benefited everyone. Clark's injury doesn't primarily threaten Clark's financial future. Her rookie deal is already locked in. What it threatens is the negotiating position of every other player in the league, the players who benefited most from the growth without being the source of it. The person who did the most to make this moment possible is the least exposed to its fallout. Everyone else is staring at a negotiating table that just got a lot less friendly. That dynamic has no clean resolution. It's just the reality of what happens when one player's impact is this asymmetric. Beneath all of the immediate financial drama, there's a more fundamental question that the league has been successfully avoiding until now. Can the WNBA realistically develop into a league with multiple genuine commercial draws, or will it always require one transcendent player to hold the whole structure up? And if it's the latter, what does long-term financial planning even look like in that environment? These aren't abstract questions. They have direct implications for every contract decision, every facility investment, every expansion approval, every broadcast deal the league pursues over the next decade. If the honest answer is that the league's commercial viability is essentially dependent on one player remaining healthy and active, then the financial commitments being discussed in CBA negotiations become extraordinarily risky for everyone involved. Team owners have a legitimate concern here that goes beyond negotiating tactics. Even if they wanted to commit to the salary structures players are demanding, doing so on the basis of a growth story that may not survive Clark's eventual retirement or a more serious injury represents a genuine business risk. Committing to long-term financial obligations based on revenue streams that could evaporate is exactly how sports franchises find themselves in crisis. Players have a genuine counter-concern. If the argument is always that the league isn't stable enough to justify better pay and conditions, then better pay and conditions will never arrive, regardless of what happens on the court. At some point, the investment in player welfare has to come before the proof of perfect financial stability, because perfect financial stability in a developing league is always just around the corner and never quite here. Both arguments have merit. Neither side is simply wrong, but the injury just made the tension between them more acute and the resolution harder to find. Professional sports has a way of forcing reckonings that everyone involved would prefer to keep postponing. For the WNBA, that reckoning arrived on the back of a quad strain at the worst possible moment, with the most significant contract negotiations in the league's history sitting right around the corner. The next 2 weeks were always going to be revealing. Every game played without Clark in the lineup was going to function as an accidental experiment. What does the WNBA actually look like when its biggest draw isn't available? The viewership data would come in.
The attendance figures would be reported, the ticket sales numbers would be public, and everyone in the league, from players to owners to broadcast partners to sponsors, would be watching those numbers and drawing their own conclusions. If the numbers held up reasonably well, if other players demonstrated the ability to maintain meaningful viewership and attendance without Clark, then the Players Association would walk into negotiations with their leverage largely intact. They could argue that the league's growth was genuinely broader than critics claimed, that multiple players contributed meaningfully to the commercial picture, and the investment case for better compensation was sound. But if the numbers cratered, and the early signals suggested that's exactly what was happening, then the entire foundation of the players' negotiating position shifts. Every ask becomes harder to justify. Every comparison to other professional leagues becomes easier to dismiss. Every argument that the league had turned a financial corner becomes susceptible to a very simple response from the ownership side. Look at what happened the moment Clark sat down.
Early indicators were not encouraging. Ticket prices that dropped by half overnight, arenas with sections that couldn't be given away, television projections that analysts were quietly revising downward. The financial experiment was running, and the results were coming in faster than anyone had hoped. There are a few possible futures branching out from this moment, and they're worth thinking through clearly. In one version of events, the league uses this crisis productively. Ownership and players come to an agreement that acknowledges the reality of Clark's outsized impact, while also investing meaningfully in developing the next generation of commercial stars. The CBA includes compromises. Players get better conditions and meaningful salary improvements. Owners get structures that protect them from overcommitting on the basis of one player's continued health. The league comes out of the negotiation with a more honest understanding of its situation and a roadmap for genuine diversification. In another version, the 2 weeks of bad numbers hardened positions on both sides. Owners use the data as justification for an aggressive stance at the table. Players, feeling their leverage has been unfairly stripped away by circumstance, push back hard. Negotiations become prolonged and contentious. The underlying tension between the league's actual financial picture and the expectations players had developed over the past 2 years doesn't get resolved. It gets postponed again, with more bitterness on both sides. And in the version nobody in the league wants to think about too carefully, Clark's injury turns out to be more significant than the initial 2-week estimate, or she sustains another injury, or the accumulation of 2 difficult weeks in the public conversation shifts sponsor and broadcast partner calculations in ways that take months to fully understand. In that scenario, everyone loses, and the window of opportunity that opened with Clark's arrival starts to close before the league figured out how to permanently prop it open. The honest answer is that nobody knows which of these futures arrives, but the injury made it undeniable that the league's financial story was more fragile than it appeared, that the growth was less broadly distributed than anyone in a position of authority had been willing to say out loud, and that the players who believed their moment had finally come may have been working with an incomplete picture of what was actually holding that moment together. Sports injuries happen. That's the nature of athletic competition, and no league can fully protect itself against the physical realities of what professional athletes go through over the course of a season. Caitlin Clark getting hurt wasn't anyone's fault. It wasn't the result of bad policy or mismanagement or negligence. It was just the random, indiscriminate way that injuries work, hitting at a moment that happened to have enormous consequences. But the vulnerability the injury exposed wasn't random. The WNBA built itself into a position where one player's health was load-bearing for the entire commercial structure, and then spent 2 years telling a public story that obscured that reality rather than addressing it. The league talked about organic growth when the growth was concentrated. It talked about a rising tide lifting all boats when the tide was almost entirely generated by one engine. It positioned itself as having turned a financial corner when it had actually found a very powerful temporary tailwind.
None of that is unique to the WNBA. Sports leagues do this regularly. They shape their public narratives around their best available stories and hope the underlying vulnerabilities don't get tested before they've had time to address them. The problem is that the underlying vulnerabilities got tested at the worst possible moment,
and the test was public, and the results were going to be documented in attendance figures and television ratings that everyone in the negotiating room would have access to. Players who had spent their careers in a league that chronically undervalued them had finally seen what felt like their moment. Record audiences, sold-out arenas, cultural conversations that made women's basketball feel relevant in ways it hadn't before. The opportunity to leverage all of that into a contract structure that actually reflected what professional athletes deserved. And then, a quad strain put all of it in jeopardy. The financial future of women's basketball was genuinely being decided in real time over the course of 2 weeks in empty sections of arenas and declining viewership numbers and ticket price alerts going out at midnight. Not in a boardroom, not in a negotiating session, in the simple, brutal arithmetic of what happens when you take one name off a marquee and watch how many people still show up. The WNBA needed this wake-up call. It needed someone to force the conversation that everyone had been avoiding. It needed the gap between the public narrative and the financial reality to become undeniable, because as long as it remained deniable, nothing was going to change. What no one could have predicted is that the person who forced that conversation would be Caitlin Clark herself, not through anything she said or did or chose, but through the simple fact of not being able to play. The league she almost single-handedly rebuilt is now going to have to figure out how to survive without her, at least temporarily. And what it discovers about itself in the process may be more important than any contract signed, any record broken, or any arena filled during the remarkable run that preceded it. The next 2 weeks were going to tell the real story of the WNBA, not the one that got written in press releases, the one written in numbers. And based on everything pointing toward those numbers, the story was going to be a difficult one to read. What do you think? Can the WNBA build enough star power to survive without depending on one player? Or is this the new permanent reality of women's professional basketball? Drop your take in the comments below.